Newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today we're going to be talking about accountability, not amnesty. And this is one of the ways that you can know for certainty that the COVID narrative is crumbling or falling apart like a soup sandwich is some of the people who are strongest supporters and some of the most fierce proponents of, lockdowns and mandates and so forth are starting to have a change of heart. And they're starting to float the idea that, well, now maybe there were some mistakes made without actually taking any responsibility. Case in point. Take a look at this. This is an actual headline from The Atlantic by Professor Emily Oster. Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. She says we need to forgive one another for what we did and said when we were in the dark about COVID. Now, before I go any further, I got to tell you, I'm righteously ticked off at where things were a year ago. And if you've forgotten what that was like, I'm going to give you a very painful reminder here in just a couple of moments. But a year ago, we were in a very dark place as a society, as a culture, as a nation, over the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. And frankly, nobody let out with greater, enthusiasm for the official narrative and, a more eagerness to squelch any of that counter narrative dissent than members of our own mainstream media. It's pretty sickening. So when you hear people start to say, well, maybe we did what we had to do, but we were all in the dark and mistakes were made. That's not a real apology. That is nothing more than narrative control. But before we go too far, let's talk a little bit about where were we the last time that we were looking at, the implications of what was being proposed. Well, let's start right at the very top. Let's start with President Biden and just get a feel of what was being said in the quest to get as many needles and as many arms as possible and get people to take the vaccine. You do recall this was just about a year ago.
We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin, and your refusal has cost all of us.
People who are incubators for every variant to come, walking around lawfully unvaccinated? That's psychotic.
For the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death. For yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm.
About this, in a world of threats and tyrants and terror, you know what our biggest enemy is in America? Our fellow Americans.
They are the ones that are propagating this outbreak.
Being frustrated that there is still a percentage of the population who are not vaccinated.
I wish that he would go further to restrict the activities of the unvaccinated.
Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
No, that was reality. I know it sucks to watch it. It sucks to relive that again, but that was the attitude, the prevailing attitude of, people in entertainment, people in politics, people on the street felt justified in wishing death on those who would not cooperate. And yet, what have we learned in the last year? Well, we've learned, among other things, that the vaccine doesn't keep you from getting COVID. It doesn't keep you from spreading COVID, but, they're still out there urging people to get it. There's still, the CDC sneaks it in the back door of, well, this is one of the mandated vaccines your kids will have to have if they want to attend public school. This is a big problem. So there's very little repentance on the part of those who pushed for mandatory vaccines, among other things. But let's remember there are some other aspects of COVID. Let's talk about why should we think hard before we extend amnesty? Well, here's a good reason why.
Hi.
How many elderly people were isolated and left to finish out their lives in utter loneliness? How many families prevented from being together because we are following the guidelines? Oh, the experts have spoken, and those experts must be heeded. I'm going to show you some headlines. And by the way, Idaho Press was right in there, towing the line and, making sure that only the official narrative was something that people would consider. But again, it was unnecessary. It didn't slow the spread of the disease. It didn't save lives. In fact, if anything, it drove a lot of people into mental anguish and a depression from which some never recovered. But again, if you think that's just a figment of my imagination, then please have another example of what COVID enforcement looked like. This one's from Australia. Well, I'd say that's a pretty good reason to be putting your hands around somebody's throat and choking them into submission if they're not wearing a face mask. Oh, by the way, did we mention that we've also seen now over the last year or so the realization and the admitting that face masks really don't do much of anything. Places that had heavy mask mandates versus those that had none, they fared about the same in terms of the infection rate, in terms of the fatality rate. But again, I see you're still unconvinced that this actually was all necessary, and really Amnesty is probably something that should be on the table for people who supported things like this. Here's something from the Netherlands. Oh yeah, that's exactly what was required, again, to keep everybody safe. But nothing says keep us safe like having the police show up to a 5-year-old's birthday party and 86 his little rear end out of a joint because he doesn't have a vaccine passport. No, you got to see this one to believe it.
You just pay the same as you can't serve. Otherwise, if you're not going to pay for it, you have the card. I know, but you don't have it, then you have to leave. And if not, no, you've had a minute. You're not going to stay here. I got the whole thing. Okay? You do have to leave, man. Right? You came in with that?
Pretty sad stuff. Now, my goal here isn't so much to get your blood pressure going as to just remind you, this is the reality of what we were dealing with over the last couple of years, but especially a year ago. And the people who pushed these policies and the people who supported and enabled those policies and the people who enforced those policies, some of them are finally starting to recognize that, the public had about enough of this. And I don't say this lightly. The calls for accountability. I know in a previous episode of Nowhere to Hide, I talked about a Senate candidate here in Idaho who was saying we need Nuremberg-style tribunals to get to the bottom of who was responsible for what. And of course, the media makes it, oh, he's invoking Nazi stuff. Well, yeah, he's invoking things where Nazis were held accountable for their crimes against humanity. And I guess the connection that perhaps some are having a difficult time making is these are crimes against humanity. And I'm not talking about just because you got on somebody's case because they weren't masked up in the grocery store. The people who engineered the lockdowns, the people who engineered the mandates, the people who sat back and thought they could unplug the economy and otherwise destroy people's livelihoods or force people into doing whatever it was that the experts were saying was the thing to do. Not only were they wrong, but they were dead wrong for forcing people to do it in the first place. So Emily Oster, I'm going to go back here again to her thing. We need to forgive one another for what we did when we were in the dark about COVID. But were they really in the dark? Because I don't think that makes so much sense. We had more than 100 years of evidence-based pandemic and epidemiological evidence and guidance and guidelines on which we could have relied. And some people actually tried to follow that body of canon. You know what happened to them, right? They were marginalized, some of them stripped of their ability to practice medicine or otherwise throttled into silence by all social media and all official outlets, or at least mass media outlets. Why would that happen? Why on earth would we give the benefit of the doubt to people who are willing to throw 100 years of guidance of how to deal with epidemics or pandemics out the window? Because they were operating from lack of knowledge. They were using panic-driven superstition, and if you try to pretend that that's equivalent with trying to take a more precautionary approach, no, that's definitely not the case. Now, even if nobody really knew anything, so let's take it for instance. What if Emily Oster is absolutely right? Well, we were just in the dark. We were trying to do the best we could. That is when humility should guide your every step. Now, why wouldn't this occur to some people? Are they just that smart? Well, come on, I'm the expert. I know all about this. But that's really the approach that was taken. The base case is always respect others and their rights. Don't panic. Don't do anything crazy or drastic without a very good reason. But that's not what happened. Instead, we had a bunch of people who saw the opportunity to seize power and flat out broke the world with zero effect on the pandemic because they were taking their lead from China. I like how a blogger, Boriquagato, puts it. The precautionary principle doesn't say every time you get scared, do the most radical thing you can think of if it feels like safety. So again, strong data-driven evidence should have prevailed, but they were cooking the evidence, and they were trying to make it fit what they wanted to happen. We got to shut things down harder. We got to shut things down harder. We got to mandate this. We got to mandate that. Conflicting messages all the time. And yet, even if, and again, giving this presumption of, okay, they really were in the dark, even so, when you're in the dark on something, how do you gain the moral authority to force on others your unfounded desires? How do you do that? Well, we didn't know, so we just had to take your rights away just in case. That's not any kind of a legit justification. In fact, it opens the doors and greases the skids for more emergency powers to be exercised just like this in the future. And this is why, when the press particularly starts to portray this as, well, people asking these kinds of questions and having these revenge fantasies about, what we're going to do to the people who push these policies or who enforce these policies, you got to understand, and I mean this with all the sincerity I can muster. There is no joy in calling someone out on such a grievous mistake. This is not just a chance, oh, goody, now we get to stone somebody. We get to play the part of the woke mob. There's something much more important at stake here than simple vengeance. This has to be held up as an example of what you do not do. And that means loss of reputation. That means loss of job. For some people, it may mean loss of freedom. And if you get high enough up the food chain, and just, hypothetically, if they were to discover that not only was this a man-made virus, but it was deliberately leaked or even accidentally leaked, and then people built upon this to build personal fortunes or obtain greater control over people, that's a big enough crime against humanity that might actually deserve a Nuremberg-style punishment. But above all, it needs to be hashed out in a court, in a criminal case, and these people need to defend themselves. Now, for some of them, it's going to mean that's the end of their career. And you can pretend that, well, what an injustice. Why would we do something like this? Look, I showed you the video clips before because stuff like that was becoming the norm. Even here in Idaho, for crying out loud, the image of police arresting, churchgoers standing and singing in the parking lot. It may have been a gentle arrest, but it was unnecessary. It was an infringement on their rights. Sarah Brady being arrested for taking her kids to the park. Well, she had it coming. She dared him to arrest her. Sorry, man. If your ego is so fragile that somebody can't, taunt you or otherwise call you out, if you're being overbearing, you maybe shouldn't be in law enforcement in the first place. So here's the thing. It's a really, really bad idea to offer amnesty, because there's really been no show whatsoever of acknowledgement that, first of all, we did something wrong. And look, I'm a believer in forgiveness. And I believe forgiveness works as much for the person who needs to have that burden taken from them, who needs to extend forgiveness to somebody, as much as it works for the person who needs forgiveness. But it cannot happen if somebody isn't honest, and if somebody doesn't at least acknowledge the reality of what was done. It's not just a, whoops, well, mistakes were made. It's a sincere mea culpa. It's standing up and taking ownership for what you did wrong, doing what you can to fix it, But you don't see a lot of that. There's not much in way of any contrition coming from the people who supported these policies. Now, I want to throw into the mix here a few headlines that were popping up throughout the last couple of years here in the state of Idaho. And I just want you to take note to the way these headlines are reported, how this helps to perpetuate that crisis, how it helps to justify, and how it always seemingly comes down on the side of the state is right, the experts are right, anybody who questions this is wrong. Look at these headlines. Idaho enters grim crisis period. Hospitals statewide on verge of rationing. Did we ever see bodies stacked up like cordwood? This is not minimizing the fact that, yeah, there were people who got sick. But look at the scare tactics. Here's another one. As Idaho schools reopen, K-12 coronavirus case numbers surge. But the survivability for anybody who gets the virus was still above 99%. Kids being among the least at risk for it. Well, surge coincides with a new school year, which has started under a patchwork of local COVID protocols. There it is. That's the lamenting. Why isn't this under some centralized overall authority? It really should be left to, the lowest possible level to determine what's right here. It's possible to get COVID-19 after vaccination, but early Idaho data show how rare it is. Now, again, this was, I believe this was from a year ago. Actually, a year ago, March. I wonder how that information has held up since. Because there sure are a lot of people who've had multiple boosters and multiple injections and still have come down with COVID. And they come for themselves with, well, it's at least it might have been worse if I hadn't been. Idaho health officials see more COVID variants in the race against time for vaccinations. Here's another one. The pandemic isn't over, Idaho. Don't you stop being scared. This is what COVID looks like here today. Idaho Department of Health and Welfare very concerned about how some schools handle COVID guidelines. See, it's all about the guidelines. It's all about somebody has to make a decision further up the line. And yet, like I showed you in a previous episode, the schools can say, well, we're just following CDC guidelines. And the CDC says, well, we told the schools you make up your own minds. Plausible deniability all the way around, yet someone's lamenting and wringing their hands. Is there enough control? And that's really what this comes down to. Public health experts release new guidelines for mass gatherings. I'm sure we all listened up on that, didn't we? House votes 55-15 in favor of resolution to void statewide guidelines on gathering sizes in pandemic. This is a good one. Because among the enforcers, and we'll take a little bit of time to give some special love and recognition to Audrey Dutton from the Idaho Capital Sun. Idaho's Dr. Ryan Cole was one of those voices of dissent. Now, you got to understand, a voice of dissent does not mean that this guy was some sawbones out there, peddling snake oil and, trephinating people's heads and drilling holes, to relieve the pressure on their brains. He was simply a voice of dissent, and it turns out it looks like he was right. But whole series of articles by Audrey dedicated to taking down Dr. Ryan Cole, dedicated to casting doubt upon him. Why haven't his credentials been stripped away? Okay, this is the kind of destruction. This is the kind of just pettiness that has been part and parcel. And this is why amnesty really isn't an option, at least until somebody says, okay, we did it. It's as bad as it looks. I'm sorry. And here's how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And here's another great one. Health misinformation was an Idaho-grown product for years. Now it has a body count. Now, again, this is implying if these people didn't get the vaccine, then they were just bringing death upon themselves. And look, I can appeal to your sense of reason. I can appeal to your sense of injustice. But suffice it to say, the people who made these calls were dead wrong on just about everything. And they rejected, again, well over a century of experience as well as actual medical science in the best way to handle a pandemic. I don't think it's an option for us to just, shrug our shoulders, suck it up, and move on. I think we need to remember that this unlocked a very ugly part of what lurks just beneath the surface in our society. And so much of it is that lust to control other people. In fact, I want to give you just a quick example of what that looks like. You remember when Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers had COVID and actually he used some non-traditional treatments, maybe ivermectin, maybe hydroxychloroquine. Nonetheless, look at this reaction from people, because someone high profile didn't follow the approved narrative and only get the vaccine and only go on remdesivir or, go on a ventilator. Check it out. They can't handle the fact that someone in the public eye didn't toe the line.
I believe Aaron Rodgers did this, Skip. I have lost so much respect.
I'm ashamed of him right now.
I think we're seeing a very different side of Aaron Rodgers, and I think we're seeing a side of Aaron Rodgers that people are really, really disgusted by.
I'm making a decision that's based on what's best for me and my own health. And for me, it was a no-brainer.
He literally is sitting home because he might kill someone.
First, he endangers people's lives. Then he doesn't take responsibility and makes up some story. Then he blames the woke crowd. He should speak at the Republican convention.
The problem with this is it is so political, and health should not be political.
He gave this interview on Friday that was just so damaging, promoting conspiracy theories, attacking the cancel culture and the woke mob, saying how Joe Rogan was his expert analysis.
While he says he talks to Harvard MDs about stuff, it was Joe Rogan that really guided him. He took stuff that is for horses.
Ivermectin is a cattle dewormer. Sorry, folks, that's what it is.
The embarrassment was going to begin as soon as he pointed out Joe Rogan as one of his touchstones of his critical thinking.
Okay, I got to stop it there. You get the point. If you dissented, you were fair game. People wished that you would lose your job. They wished that you would be marginalized from society. In many cases, they wished that you would die gurgling on a ventilator somewhere. Does that sound like the position of a person who is coming at this from a position of strength, a position of conviction and calmness of conscience because they've thought things through and they've reasoned out this is right and this is wrong? Because that sure doesn't to me. That sounds like desperate, petty little children who want to inflict pain or suffering on anybody who isn't doing exactly what they have been cowed into doing. It's just sick and it's wrong. And the bottom line is this. I would be very willing to extend forgiveness to somebody if they were willing to take ownership for their mistake. But when you take that mistake and you make it mine by forcing on me actions or restrictions that I don't explicitly consent to, and you threaten the livelihoods of people who've never harmed you because you're running around half-cocked in the dark and you have no respect for other people or their rights, that's pretty different. That's not something that I think we can just easily shrug off. And some people will hear this, why that sounds like a call for violence. Not at all. It's a call to prevent future violence being visited upon us by the same people who pushed this unnecessary intrusion and abandonment of medical principles and medical science. So again, I don't know what the ultimate accountability needs to be, but I would settle for start by separating them from power, take their authority away, do not allow them to exercise any kind of power whatsoever. And then we can start sorting out who are the more culpable ones, who did more damage. Governor Cuomo, I mean, come on, how many people died in nursing homes because of his mandate? Well, let's send all these patients to the nursing homes. There needs to be accountability. So, in interest of that, here is an alternative. Let's declare pandemic tribunals. We need to find and hold accountable everyone involved in crafting lies and destroying lives while attempting to keep people in the dark about COVID. Now, that's something I think I could probably get behind. And again, this is where our media really has dropped the ball. When did they push back? When did they play devil's advocate even? They didn't. They kept the fear alive. They questioned anyone who departed from the narrative in the least and did their best to marginalize them. That's a pretty egregious thing to do. And it was deliberately for the purpose of keeping people in the dark. Now, we can also, comfort ourselves on the idea that, a lot of the media is, corporate owned, so they all had to toe the line. And maybe that's an excuse for some, but it's still. I know people who were at least brave enough that they would walk away from their job before they would participate in a lie or would otherwise surrender their ability to think for themselves when it came to this issue. Where's that kind of ethical background, or where's that kind of ethical analysis in today's media? I mean, I'm looking around for it, but I'm not seeing it. I don't know. Is it just the need? I got to be right. We need to be right. We can't ever admit that we're wrong. People would lose confidence. Here's the surprising thing. If you can admit that you're wrong and actually take ownership for a mistake and say, you know what, I didn't know that. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to understand what I didn't understand before. People will be remarkably forgiving. But the arrogance, that arrogance is really unbecoming. And unfortunately, it's turning a lot of people against the media and politicians and others, the experts who force this kind of stuff on us. So the beginning of accountability is kicking off. Where it leads, I don't know. I'm not hoping for, violence. I'm not hoping for bad things to happen to people, but I hope enough deterrence comes from this that anyone who's tempted to do something like this in the future will think twice and really consider whether it's worth the price that they would pay, either reputationally or career-wise or with their own freedom. Because they sure harmed a lot of people. And ultimately, this is about making sure that they cannot do that again. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.